Reading 94 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 1. Birdlip, November 13th, 1943. On rebirth. Jesus said on one occasion that many things appear in the Gospels about the inner teaching on man's nature and possibilities, but that usually the essential points are left out. They are either left out or given in the wrong order and appear without connection. In the extract from G's talks that I am now going to quote, 3 main ideas are spoken about: death, birth, and sleep. Everyone knows that the New Testament says that a man can be reborn, or born again, or born anew, or born from above, as literally interpreted. Christ says to Nicodemus, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. This means, in the language of the work, that a man cannot enter the conscious circle of humanity unless he is born anew, or born from the work. Strictly speaking, the work would say, unless he is born, because physical birth is not being born in the esoteric sense. When a man ceases to be mechanical man, when he becomes conscious, when real I appears in him, then he is a man. In the 7 categories of men given in the work, numbers 1, 2, and 3 men, which comprise the bulk of humanity, belong to the circle of mechanical men, the circle of confusion of tongues, of Babel, where no one can ever agree and no one can understand the other person. We can say that those who are born agree with one another and understand one another, for the 2 things are the same. Amongst conscious humanity, there is understanding. We seek in this work to learn a common language in order to understand each other a little better. We seek ultimately to be born, but in order to be born we must die. And in order to die we must first awaken. Christ, in the words attributed to him, says simply, a man must be born again before he can enter the kingdom of God. In another place he says, we must awaken, translated as watch, and pray. In another place Christ says, except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. You will see in what follows how things are wrongly arranged, indeed, as if by people who did not really understand what they heard. Suppose the teaching had been clear in the Gospels that a man must awaken before he can do anything else, and that in this is included becoming conscious of what he is like. One would imagine that in that case the whole course of exoteric Christianity would have gone differently. If you think for a moment, you will see how impossible it is to die to oneself unless one awakens to oneself, however painful the awakening may be. I will add one thing more here. You remember that it is said that C influences which come directly from conscious mankind are always turned into B influences when they pass out into life. From those schools which were connected with Christ, nothing emerged into outer life for at least half a century. It is only within the atmosphere of a school that C influences can be really preserved. Without this atmosphere, people will adapt them to themselves and to their level of understanding and to what they think is right or wrong. The consequence is that essential points are missed. Things are wrongly arranged. All harsh things are left out. And things that seem incredible from a life point of view are also omitted. Moreover, everything is adulterated with the general prejudices, general customs, and moral views of the time. Then you must remember that in those days every manuscript had to be copied by hand, and the scribes would naturally alter sentences that they did not agree with or understand, or they would insert things that they thought ought to have been said, etc. C influences cannot exist in life, and always turn into B influences. The mind of man, based on the senses, has to be raised so that he no longer, to give one example, thinks in terms of yes or no about everything. Now I would like to read to you something that G said many years ago. Quote, I am often asked questions in connection with the various texts, parables, and so on from the Gospels. In my opinion, the time has not yet come for us to speak about the Gospels. This requires more knowledge. But from time to time, we will take certain Gospel texts as points of departure for our discussions. This will teach you to treat them in the right way, and above all, to realize that in the texts known to us, the most essential points are usually missing. To begin with, let us take the well-known text about the seed which must die in order to be born. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. This text has many different meanings, and we shall often return to it. But first of all, it is necessary to know the principle contained in this text in its full measure as applied to man. There is a book of aphorisms which has never been published and probably never will be published. I have mentioned this book before in connection with the meaning of knowledge, and I quoted then one aphorism from the book. In relation to what we are speaking of now, this book says the following. A man may be born, but in order to be born, he must first die, and in order to die, he must first awake. In another place it says, when a man awakes, he can die. When he dies, he can be born. We must find out what this means. To awake, to die, to be born. These are 3 successive stages. If you study the Gospels attentively, you will see that references are often made to the possibility of being born. Several references are made to the necessity of dying, and there are very many references to the necessity of awakening. Watch, for ye know not the hour, and so on. But these 3 possibilities of man to awake or not to sleep, to die and to be born, are not set down in connection with one another. Nevertheless, this is the whole point. If a man dies without having awakened, he cannot be born. If a man is born without having died, he may become an immortal thing. Thus, the fact that he has not died prevents a man from being born. The fact of his not having awakened prevents him from dying. And should he be born without having died, he is prevented from being. We have already spoken enough about the meaning of being born. This relates to the beginning of a new growth of essence, the beginning of the formation of individuality, the beginning of the appearance of one indivisible I. But in order to be able to attain this, or at least to begin to attain it, a man must die. That is, he must free himself from 1,000 petty attachments and identifications which hold him in the position in which he is. He is attached to everything in this life, attached to his imagination, attached to his stupidity, attached to his sufferings, and possibly to his sufferings more than to anything else. He must free himself from this attachment. Attachment to things, identification with things, keep alive 1,000 useless eyes in a man. These eyes must die in order that the big eye may be born. But how can they be made to die? They do not want to die. It is at this point that the possibility of awakening comes to the rescue. To awaken means to realize one's nothingness. That is, to realize one's complete and absolute mechanicalness and one's complete and absolute helplessness. And it is not sufficient to realize it philosophically in words. It is necessary for a man to realize it in clear, simple, and concrete facts, in his own facts. When a man begins to know himself a little, he will see in himself many things that are bound to horrify him. So long as a man is not horrified at himself, he knows nothing about himself. He decides to throw it off, stop it, put an end to it. But however many efforts he may make, he feels that he cannot do this, that everything remains as it was. Here, he will see his impotence, his helplessness, and his nothingness. Or again, when he begins to know himself, a man sees that he has nothing that is his own. That is, that all that he has regarded as his own, his tastes, his views, thoughts, convictions, habits, even faults and vices, all these are not his own, but they have been borrowed somewhere, ready-made. In feeling this, a man may feel his nothingness. And in feeling his nothingness, a man should see himself as he really is, not for a second, not for a moment, but constantly, never forgetting it. This continual consciousness of his nothingness and of his helplessness will eventually give a man courage to die, and that is, to die not merely mentally or in his consciousness, but to die in fact, and to renounce actually and forever those aspects of himself which are either unnecessary from the point of view of his inner growth or which hinder it. These aspects are, first of all, his false I, and then all the fantastic ideas about his individuality, will, consciousness, capacity to do, his powers, initiative, determination, and so on. Note: I would like to say that we should understand and always try to keep in mind that in this work we are not trying to remain as we are, but to change, and that change does not mean remaining as we are. All change is inner and starts from the inner, from beginning to see what one is like. No one can remain the same as he is and change. Buffers, attitudes, pictures of oneself, mechanical behavior, typical forms of internal considering, of making accounts against others, all our ideas of life and ways of thinking, and forms of self-estimation, above all, the ways in which we identify. All these things in ourselves must change if we are going to change. You cannot, as long as you hold on to your buffers and ingrained ways of taking and judging things, your self-esteem and your typical reactions, become changed in yourself, even if you go into a desert and live on a glass of water a day. To change, it is necessary that people work on themselves and try to separate themselves from what they are and observe themselves in accordance with what the work says.